Julian Barnes, why did you want to put Shostakovich through your lens?
I've been obsessed with him both as a composer and as a man who exemplified the clash between art and power and what it did to him. First listened to his music when I was about 18. Then about 25 years later, a book was published called Testimony, which was supposedly the memoirs of Shostakovich, published after his death, 1990. And this made me aware of what we call the Shostakovich case, and what his political position was, what his personal position was, how he survived, and so on. All the questions we ask about an artist under stress, under political stress.
You, in the intervening period, though, have written a number of other books. So this has been burbling away.
Yes, I mean, I'm a child of the Cold War, after all. I remember when my English master said he had sent his wife to the country because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I thought, oh, this politics stuff, you know, it could come home to roost. And I went to Russia with some student friends and drove around in 1965 for a month or so. And I wrote a novel in 1991 called The Porcupine, which was about the trial of a Eastern Bloc dictator. So I've always been a Russophile. I mean, I read Russian at school and a bit at university, and Russian literature is I suppose, my second foreign literature after French.
The book has a three-part structure. So what are these three big moments for Shostakovich?
Well, the first is in 1936, when his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk is condemned after Stalin and his henchmen went to see a performance and walked out.
And this very day, was the
and
editorial.
two days after that performance, Shostakovich was on a concert tour in Arkhangelsk in northern Russia. And he opened a copy of Pravda at the railway station, and he saw on page 3, 80 years ago this morning, the headline, "Muddle instead of music." And he knew things were likely to get very bad for him. And the article ended, "It is a game of clever ingenuity which might end very badly." Now, when you saw those words in Pravda, you thought, they could stop me composing, they could take my life, anything could happen. It was the time of terror. It was also a leap year, and Shostakovich was very superstitious about leap years. Shuttle forward 12 years, 1948, another leap year. He's sent to New York to a peace congress at the personal request of Stalin, and he endures a kind of artistic humiliation in front of people, and denounces, amongst others, Stravinsky, whom he regarded privately as the greatest composer of the 20th century. And he thought that was the worst day of his life, the most humiliating day of his life. Shuttle forward another 12 years, another leap year, and we get to 1960, which is the year when, after a lifetime of enormous political pressure, he finally joined the Communist Party, a thing he said he would never do. He always used to say, "I will never join a party that kills." But then he fell into the argument, this is in Khrushchev's time, who have we killed? Give me the name of anyone we've killed. You must join the party.
In the book, you discuss in a way whether being a hero is easier than being a coward.
Yes, it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, often looking at a tyrannical state from the outside, we want people to be heroes, but then we're also asking for their blood when we do. And to be a hero, you can throw a bomb, you can pull a trigger, and then you're wiped out. On the other hand, in Soviet Russia, in Stalin's Russia, it wasn't just you who was wiped out, it was your family, your friends, everyone was corrupted by your fall. So your only choice really was to compromise and pay Caesar. And that's what Shostakovich did. He paid Caesar as best he could, while keeping as much of himself, his private soul and his music as untouched as possible. Of course, everyone becomes contaminated.
But it is too simple simply to condemn him, and in the book you make a compelling argument for his own cowardice.
Yes. I mean, anyway, it's a novel, so we want moral complexity.
Yes.
That's what it's about.
So you've got a perfect character for moral complexity.
You have, yes. And of course, he was condemned both internally and externally, simply because he was a Soviet poster boy. Therefore, many people in the West thought, oh, well, he can't be any good then. I know people who think Shostakovich is rubbish. And I think part of that is because he was the leading Soviet composer.
Yeah,
but he was also a deeply Russian composer. This is part of it, you know. And this is at one point he reflects on the very phrase Soviet Russia. He says to be a Soviet was to be optimistic, but to be a Russian was to be pessimistic by your very nature, and therefore it's a contradiction in terms, Soviet Russia.
And where others left, Nabokov, for example, he stayed. He couldn't go. Why do you think he couldn't go?
I think he didn't want to go. Prokofiev, for example, he left about when the revolution broke out, and he came back from time to time, and then he came back permanently in the mid-1930s. And Shostakovich always thought they admired one another in a rather cagey way, but Shostakovich didn't think that Prokofiev understood the full tragedy of the situation, and I think he was just too Russian. He wasn't a cosmopolitan like Prokofiev was. I think he was a little, though he had eventually good friends in the West like Benjamin Britten, Peter Pears, I think he was a wary character.
There's a scene at the beginning of the book where he has his first meeting with power, as it was, you know, the forces of Stalin, after that editorial, and he thinks that he is going to be purged, and he waits outside the lift for almost a fortnight.
Yes, after Lady Macbeth was condemned, the following year he was sort of caught up in the fringes of a general's plot. He happened to know a guy called Marshal Tukhachevsky, who was very popular and very successful general. Very bad idea, because Stalin, of course, was the greatest general of all, and Tukhachevsky and many other Soviet generals were purged. He had actually been a patron of Shostakovich's because he was very interested in music, Tukhachevsky. And so 1937, Shostakovich was summoned to what they called the Big House, which is the headquarters of the NKVD, the secret police in Leningrad. And he had an interview of which the only sort of pseudo-transcript emerged years after Shostakovich's death. So it's a very unreliable account of the interview. Indeed, we don't even know the name of the interrogator. It comes down in 3 different versions, according to which book you read, which, of course, is hell for a biographer, but wonderful for a novelist, because you just pick and choose. So he went there, and he was told that he had to come back in 2 days and agree to various statements about, you know, who had said what, who was in the plot, and so on. And he thought that he was probably going to be taken away and shot. What happened, oddly, on the weekend between the Saturday and the Monday was that the interrogator himself was purged. So he was sort of off the hook for a bit, but he still thought that he would be taken away. And so he spent the nights standing on the landing outside his flat by the lift doors, because he didn't want his wife and child, you know, the trauma of having the door broken down in the middle of the night, child taken away, perhaps taken away to a Soviet orphanage where she'd be brought up as a good communist and would never know who her parents were. That was unthinkable to him. But that was quite normal in Soviet Russia.
There's this tension between whether or not one can have personal integrity and artistic integrity. And without the personal integrity, you have Shostakovich's music. And
Yes.
you listen to it all the time. And I wonder whether or not when you listen to it, you listen to different pieces in different ways.
Yes, he had what he called a 3-drawer system. And in the top drawer, he put all the stuff that he wrote very easily at the behest of power. Film music, music for windy, empty choral pieces for the Red Army Choir and things like that. The bottom drawer was his really private stuff, things which spoke of his deepest feelings and emotions, often string quartets, things like that. In the middle, there was the stuff that had to be negotiated, you know, his symphonies. We have to remember that in the Soviet Union, everything was controlled. If you're a composer, you couldn't even buy manuscript paper unless you were a member of the Union of Composers. Every piece of music you wrote had to be licensed, and if it wasn't licensed, it wasn't either performed, and you weren't paid for it. The system was completely different. For example, there was a lot of music on the radio. You never got any royalties for that. So you could find that your your music had fallen to some extent out of favour, that people were scared of putting it on in concert halls, that conductors would go missing at the last minute because they were frightened of the consequences. But you might still hear your music being played on the radio, but you wouldn't get a bean for it. So there were all sorts of areas of extraordinary difficulty, which artists who are not, by their nature, practical people, were forced to negotiate all through their working lives.
You have Shostakovich say, it's easy being a communist if you don't live in a communist country. And actually you talk about Picasso and Sartre.
Yes. One of the interesting sides of Shostakovich is he was a great ironist, and he was also very sarcastic. And he was particularly harsh on fair weather friends, and on those who he saw as, you know, helping enforce and entrench Stalinism. So he said, he said of Picasso, you know, he lives in comfort in Paris. He paints that terrible shit he paints. And what happens when an artist, if any artist in the Soviet Union tried to paint like him, he'd be taken away. And would Picasso say a word? Has Picasso ever said a word? And he hadn't. Same with Stravinsky, you know. Stravinsky, whom Shostakovich revered. They met twice. It was a very uneasy meeting on both occasions. Stravinsky never went to the help of any persecuted Soviet composer. So in answer to an earlier remark of yours, Shostakovich's conclusion is that you can have artistic integrity, as Stravinsky did, and not have moral integrity. He thought that that was a weakness on Stravinsky. Whereas, of course, Stravinsky, being an exile in America, was caught up in American politics. And didn't want to go to the Peace Congress that Shostakovich attended, because he thought that would get him in trouble with the American authorities.
So you have, on one hand, you have the kind of Solzhenitsyn figure, on the other side, the Shostakovich figure. Which do you think you would have been? I mean, this is a perennial question. Where do you think you would have your strength? What would your strength be?
Oh, I think I would have been a coward. I think I would have done some kind of deal in order to keep on writing and keep on being published. I mean, Shostakovich used to say that music is not like Chinese eggs. It doesn't gain by being buried in the ground for years. And so he didn't think that when a piece of his was banned, it would get better with time. He just thought the people for whom it was being written were not getting the benefit of it. It's a question that I think quite a lot of people in the West occasionally ask, what would I do under oppression? What would I do under tyranny? The only sort of example we've had in recent years was the German occupation of the Channel Islands, in which people behaved just pretty much as they did in France and other conquered countries, shipped off the few Jews they had, and so on and so forth. I don't think we would be necessarily any braver than any other country.
The book is about truth and freedom and conscience. I wonder if you think now that there is artistic freedom in Russia?
Well, I'd be very wary about writing a satirical novel about Putin. I'm not a Kremlinologist. I'm not an expert on the state of things in Russia. It's clear that for example, things like the art world has been greatly freed up. This book will be almost certainly published in Russia, though I have been banned in Iran, rather to my surprise, recently. I think the Pussy Riot case showed that unusual forms of artistic activity are not welcomed. It's very interesting the way Putin is going. I mean, he does keep us on the hop, doesn't he? Did you see a few days ago he announced that he denounced Lenin for the first time? Astonishing. He said that Lenin shouldn't have killed the Romanov royal family, and that in laying out the Soviet Union on ethnic grounds with those boundaries, he put a bomb under the USSR. Astonishing denunciation. It
was astonishing because, on the other hand, I mean, basically, the truth is hard to find in Russia, is what was said in the book. But actually, when you think now about Litvinenkov and also about Nemtsov,
yes, Yes.
And also about corruption. The truth is still hard to find in Russia.
It is, yes. Well, I think they've always been good at that, the Russians. One of my favourite Russian sayings, which I used as an epigraph to one of my novels 20 years ago, and I repeat in the book, is "He lies like an eyewitness," which is so wonderfully ironic and so Russian and so Shostakovich. And they do say of Putin, don't they? They say that he's very, very straightforward to deal with, and when he lies brilliantly.
Because you're talking about a modern tyrant in the book, you know, you go down layer after layer and you'll find texture that doesn't change. The granite encloses yet more granite, and there is no gave of conscience to be found.
Yes.
Is that Putin?
No, it's not Putin, because this is Shostakovich reflecting on Stalin, really. I mean, the thing, not everyone, Tolstoy didn't love Shakespeare, but Russians traditionally love Shakespeare. And there's a bit in the book where Shostakovich is talking about how Shakespeare is a bit of a softie, really, because his tyrants, like, you know, Macbeth, have a conscience. When they kill, they have bad dreams. And he thinks that actually, later on, he thinks, actually, maybe I did him a disservice. Maybe in the old days, when there was religion, people had a bad conscience. But nowadays, does Stalin have a sleepless night? We don't think so, you know. He might have a sleepless night about whether someone was going to kill him, but he wouldn't have a sleepless night about who he'd killed.
But if you were in opposition to Putin, given what's happened to Nemtsov, given what happened to Litvinenko, would you have sleepless nights?
Oh, yes. I mean, I would. If I was Putin, I don't know if I would.
No, sorry.
If I were
a member of the opposition, would you? Given that the opposition seems to be dying off.
Yes, that's right. I'd have sleepless days as well. And you can understand why they're building mansions, the rich ones, all around me in North London.
Which is interesting now, because there is a kind of resurgence of interest and kind of affection for Russia from the British left.
Yes. I don't think it's the shining city on the hill anymore, but I think it's always good to have an alternative way of doing things. I mean, I don't think autocracy is necessarily the best answer, but I remember when the wall came down, I remember being very disappointed with Western politicians, because I thought that they would say, now we can painlessly and without any fear look at what left-wing systems had and maybe take some of the best that they had and put it with some of the best we had. Whereas in fact, when the Cold War ended, everyone was sort of high-fiving and saying, we're the best, our system has won, there is no alternative, you know, you can only have capitalism. And there were terrible consequences in Eastern Europe. I mean, complete collapse of money, pensioners who'd been, you know, worked as surgeons, say, all of a sudden having to go and dig their allotments. I have friends in Bulgaria who told me all about it. And then often kind of the worst form of capitalist was the first in. I remember being told about Robert Maxwell's visits to Bulgaria and Romania, and he visited Bulgaria first and had to the ambassador had to sort of slightly kowtow. His official car was driving along, following Maxwell's aeroplane in the sky. Maxwell then announced that he was going to Romania. And he called ahead, the pilot called ahead to Bucharest airport and said, Robert Maxwell is about to land. Maxwell had been an old friend of the Ceausescu's. And the message came back, Mr. Maxwell is certainly allowed to land, but we should advise him that it's perfectly possible between the airport and the capital that someone will kill him. And so he didn't land in Bucharest. So often, you know, it wasn't necessarily, here comes capitalism, you don't necessarily get the moral guys in first, you get the cowboys.
But you talked about being a child of the Cold War and having, you know, very distinct memories of what repression really was. And I wonder if you think that we take free speech and the attacks on free speech too casually in this country now. Particularly on no platforming is really what I'm talking about now.
Yes.
That actually, what do you make of the idea of no platforming?
Oh, I think it's crazy, especially in an academic situation where the whole point of being young and clever and at university is to have your views challenged and opposed, and to have forceful figures like Germaine Greer come and annoy you. I mean, and make you think for yourself. So I think no platforming is a very, very bad idea.
I mean, I interviewed Germaine Greer about that time, and she was really angry and deeply, you know, I mean, she didn't really want to go to Cardiff, she said in the end, but I mean, she was deeply upset about the whole notion of putting some kind of rein on free speech. Is there any rein that should be on free speech at all?
Well, hate speech, obviously, incitement to violence and racial hatred and religious hatred, sure, yes. On the other hand, I sometimes think there should be a certain rein put on religious speech, being an agnostic myself. And I think I would take religion out of schools altogether. I'd make it a lay educational system.
Like France, like America.
Yeah, you get I mean, children get enough religion at home and at church or mosque without having it at school as well, in my view.
Because not only is the no platforming interesting now, the whole, you know, the revision, the idea about, you know, we should remove the Cecil Rhodes statue, for example, because of all what it stands for. What do you think about that?
Well, what I think about that is I agree with a student at the Oxford College where the statue is, who wrote a piece saying, well, actually, I think it's slightly more important to point out that at this college there are only 2 students of colour. And maybe we should fix that first before worrying about some brute from the 19th century. I think it's... I wonder how inciting it is to the soul of someone who gazes up and thinks that that man was beastly to his or her ancestors. I mean, I'm sure some of it is genuine. I think some of it is ill-focused. I think you should look at what the immediate problem on the ground is, and that is diversity in Oxford colleges.
Because this idea that, you know, universities particularly should be places of ideas, of difference, of challenge. Yes. And when you have the no platform, particularly on the issue of gender and trans, is that not quite dangerous?
I think it is, because it's not just that we don't want Germaine Greer or whoever talking about this issue, which has enraged us, her views on it have enraged us. It's we don't want her talking about anything. It's because you disagree with someone about one item of thought, therefore the rest of their thinking is not only uninteresting but wrong too. And that's a kind of closing of the mind. I mean, the mind is often closes. I don't know when there was ever a golden age. I mean, I remember back in the 60s when I was at Oxford, there was a great sort of clash of ideas, and there was probably some no platforming then as well. Anything to do with South Africa, for example, there would be no platforming there. I think, you know, we should challenge ideas. That's the point of it.
But the reason I wanted to talk a little bit more about the trans, it seems is one of the big debates of our beginning of the 21st century. It's suddenly become one of the big debates that, you know, your identity is more than the physical manifestation of it.
Yes, I think that is a very interesting debate, and we should listen to those who are at the centre of it and undergoing it. But I don't think we should be told there's one answer. I think people are allowed to think differently about these things, as long as it doesn't translate into either hate speech or hate action. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that gender is more fluid than it was when I was growing up and you were growing up, you know, and notion and you know, who knows, in 100 years perhaps passports won't have sex difference on them, and everyone will think, God, they were really stupid in the past, weren't they? And now they finally woke up. They woke up in the 2040s.
Just finally, the book sheds light for a generation that won't really know much about Shostakovich. I wonder, as a writer of fiction in this case, whether there are certain liberties you can take and certain liberties you can't take. And you've given voice to Shostakovich, a kind of voice that he didn't have in his own lifetime. Do you feel a responsibility about that?
I feel a responsibility to be as true to what I believe the truth to be. but truth is a very hard thing to find at the time. Many accounts of what was said and done didn't emerge until after Shostakovich's death. There's an awful lot of sort of artistic politics around him. As a novelist, you have the freedom to say, this is the truth, rather than it could be this or it could be that, which as a biographer or a historian you'd be forced to say. And also there's that terrible biographer's past conditional tense. Surely at this point Shostakovich must have been thinking that had he done otherwise he would not have been feeling what he was feeling. As a novelist you just cut to the chase, and that's what I like doing as a novelist. You get rid of all superfluous matter, all ifs and buts, and you give your version of the truth.
Julian Barnes, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.